Hello.
Hey, there you are. All right. So, oh my God, I have so many questions for you already, but I don't know what I can say and I can't say. You used to work for the FBI and the White House, and I have this vision of the data in the FBI and any government body as being just a total mess. But then I think about it and I think, well, there's a lot of stuff that rides on that data. And you gonna talk to us about it? Maybe you can say, am I wrong or am I right? Is it a mess? Is it like, because when I go to the DMV, that's a disaster. But I I imagine the FBI does things a little different.
It is interesting that you started off with that question because now I'm like, man, I should rewrite my whole talk on the fly to we could have a whole
No,
conversation
no,
about what
sorry. Don't let me
data
derail the
structures,
talk.
data privacy, and data reliability looks like at various levels of government.
Mm.
Uh, I will just sum it up by saying it is both much better and much worse than you imagine. At the same time, both things can be true. So I
No
don't
way.
know if that comforts you or scares you, but the government is hiring technical positions. So there are ways for people, ways for people to support or to work on those challenges. And I'm a huge fan of public services. I've spent a lot of time in government, but to your point, I will answer questions about nearly anything when we get into the Q&A portion. So both about my prepared remarks and anything else that's data related.
Incredible. Well, I'm going to let you take over. Thank you so much for humoring me with that. And I love it. What a great start.
All right, thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined, depending on what time of the day you are joining. If you've been sitting for a while, take a few seconds to just sort of stretch and get ready just to dive in. My name, as has been said, is Afua Bruce. I am the founder and principal of ANB Advisory Group. We are a consulting firm that works with organizations funding, implementing, or designing responsible tech and data solutions. I started off my career as a software engineer and have spent the last several years of my career really thinking about what the intersection of technology, society, and policy look like. And so to do that, I have spent some time, as has been mentioned, in government agencies, specifically in the federal government as a full-time employee, but consulting with and training a lot of state and local government officials on the use of data, the structure of data, and different data applications. I've also spent time in a think tank, also spent time in a nonprofit that did data science and AI for other nonprofits and government agencies around the world. And then I currently teach at Carnegie Mellon University. So I bring to this talk on reliability and risk, sort of a combination of all of that experience. How do we really think about how data matters, what its contribution is to risk and reliability? How does that need to sit into the both cultural and business and society lens that we all operate in on a day-to-day basis? So with that, let's dive in. Next slide, please. All right, so I wanted to start the conversation today with just the textbook definition of risk of data reliability engineering. And this particular definition I took from the Monte Carlo site, and it says, you can read along with me, the data reliability engineer is responsible for helping an organization deliver high data availability and quality through the entire data lifecycle, from ingestion to end products, dashboards, machine learning models, production data sets. And I'd offer that there are many other things that the data lifecycle contributes to. So the reason why I started with this definition is that even though sort of the established field of data reliability engineering is fairly new, as we think about different disciplines of software engineering, we're coalescing around this definition. And this definition is very sort of data and lifecycle focused. It is very focused on what are we collecting and what are we doing with that information. But I'd argue that there is much more to data problems and data reliability than simply the data. As we move to the next slide, please. we see here what I'd offer to you is that tools and processes are built on and built for people. So even as we think about data reliability engineering as the tools and processes, the dashboards, the machine learning models, the data sheets, as was mentioned in that definition, it's important to recognize that all of that information is built for people to use, actual humans to use, humans with all of their biases, all of their idiosyncrasies, all of the times that they follow the instructions exactly as written. And then the rest of the time where, of course, they ignore everything that you told them to do because they did not read the documentation. The tools are also, when I say built on people, it's because the data that is collected really represents the thoughts, the feelings, the decision making, the information sort of encoded in people's behaviors or intent. All of that is designed by people. And so the tools and processes of doing data work are really built on people. So as we think about what data reliability needs to look like, we have to recognize that the tools and processes we use to carry out that function to make sure that what we are doing is reliable, what we're doing can be counted on, what we produce can be validated and available when needed. We have to recognize the human element in that process. We have to understand what does the community that uses this tool, the community that is making decisions off of this tool, what are they going to be taking into that? What are they going to be doing with it? And what are their actual sort of intents and goals? And how can what we do as software data reliability engineers really influence that process? And so now let's go to the next slide. And just to continue with breaking down some of the definitions of data reliability engineering, these 7 principles you probably recognize because they are the DRE Con aspects or principles of data reliability engineering. And as you start to look at each of these, you can understand how people are integral into each of these. And so when we talk about embracing risk, first of all, the idea of how we define risk, what risks we want to take, what risks we don't want to take is very much a human decision. It's perhaps with your direct team, perhaps with your management, perhaps with executive management, or perhaps set by industry regulations for what that looks like. But you can see where the people component is there. The setting standards and reducing the toll is also very human-centered. Again, what do we decide is the right thing to do? What do we decide are the values that we are incorporating into our design? Are we valuing from the start accessibility, for example? Are we valuing from the start a diversity of information, people who have access, validating the diversity of information that's in there? And so that's really important to do there. Now, the monitoring everything and using using automation and controlling releases, these are 3 principles that can skew very much on the more technical or data-driven side rather than on the people side. However, as you think about what actually needs to be automated, what is best for automation versus an actual person, as you think about what a release process looks like and what controls need to be put in place, those are, again, the people elements that really do come down to, in many cases, preferences and business context or perhaps policy context, depending on the environment or the sector that you're working in. And then finally, maintaining simplicity is important, yes, because as code gets more and more complex, there's more and more ways for it to go wrong. But also, again, as we think about those outputs that were mentioned in the first definition of data reliability engineering that I put up, is to the outputs of dashboards and machine learning models, maintaining simplicity is important, again, also for this very human concept. And how will people actually be able to use the technology that you've created, use the data that you are ensuring is there and is available. And so as we go to the next slide, I'll just sum up my theory on this and saying where we're coming from and where we want to go to. And so I think where we're coming from is this idea of what is a data problem versus what is a system problem? Really divorcing data problems, again, from sort of the system problems, the people problems, and saying that we can isolate the data and put it over to one side, and we can isolate the people and the systems in which the data is working and which the data was taken from and put it on another side. And so what I'd argue is that instead of asking ourselves what's a data problem versus what's a system problem, we want to instead ask ourselves, where is the bridge between these problems? And so say we've got data in one place, we've got systems in one place, but what are the touch points? What are the areas in which we can clearly see how data influences people or people influence data? And so that's the framework with which I'll just go through a couple more things. But that's the question that I hope you take away from this presentation today is, where is the bridge between the data problems and the system problems for the systems that you're managing, for the organizations you're working with, for the business models that you are maintaining, or even for the policy processes that you're informing. Next slide, please. All right, so if we're going to shift to this idea of where is the intersection between these two areas, what are the additional things that we should think of? So these 4 points are the things you should be thinking of. So first and foremost is obviously your users, and these are both internal and external users. I think oftentimes when we think about data reliability, we think of the internal users who might be looking to make a business decision off of it, who might be looking for uptime stats or something like that. But you also have to recognize that whatever you're doing internally does have some ramifications for external customers or external community members. And so being able to identify how what you're working on and what specific system you're building or tool you're creating both helps internally, but also what's its effects externally. Who's being affected by the decisions that are being made, or who even externally will be using the tools that you're developed, and what are their actual needs? How do they actually need to engage with what you're creating? What are the decisions they actually want to make? What are they hoping for from your software? And make sure that's then reflected in what you develop. I think sometimes as technical folks, we can assume that we know best, and that is not the case. And so as you, in addition to the data, you want to consider the users. The second thing that I want to encourage you to consider is policies and regulation. And again, these are both internal and external. Now, I'm sure whatever organization you're working in has a number of policies that I'm sure you read in detail all the time, even if a lawyer doesn't tell you you need to, but recognizing those internal policies, and then again, especially recognizing the external policies. The external policies and regulations and the extent to which they affect what you are developing can vary greatly by sector. Heavily regulated sectors such as aviation or the biomedical or pharmaceutical industries, for example, have a lot more regulations on even what software can look like that supports those. But even in the absence of that, it's important to have a base level understanding of what policies and regulations affect the broader system that your tool is operating in, the broader system that your tool affects. And so understanding that. The third thing, in addition to the data, you want to consider are both values and biases. So it's really important to think through what are the values you have. I co-wrote a book called The Tech That Comes Next, and even though we talk a lot about technical solutions, we started with what are the values that we want to say all technology is built on? Because whether or not you sort of explicitly state what the values are, you encode values into your software. We've seen how a significant change in values can really change what the output of a system looks like. We've seen it in Twitter, for example, in other software and other software platforms that have been rolled out. When you have a significant change in leadership or values, it really changes what the priorities are and how reliable or what risk is accepted into that system. And so being clear from the start as to sort of what the values you're building on are, as well as biases, we all have them, where that appears in data, where that appears in coding decisions and other places. Having an awareness of that so you can then mitigate those biases is really important. And the last thing to consider here is really making sure you're thinking about inclusion by design. And so this means that as you're thinking about your design teams, as you're thinking about the data itself, as you're thinking about the users, make sure to be inclusive as possible. And do this on a number of metrics, making sure that you have people from different disciplines in the room, different ethnicities in the room, different genders in the room, to help you think through what does inclusion really look like in the software that we're developing. Next slide, please. All right, so I've talked about a number of different pieces of sort of why it's important to think about reliability especially, but risk also in terms not just of the data and of the technical tools, but of the people as well. And so I want to give you an example of what that looks like. This headline, "Bad software sent postal workers to jail because no one wanted to admit it could be wrong," comes from an article that was published on The Verge in 2021. And in short, it detailed the story of the UK Post Office and its use of software called Horizon. Now, Horizon was a software that several postmasters used and all the post offices used to basically track the cash balance that was left over, or cash balances from different branches. And the short version of the story is that Horizon started to show a number of postmasters were stealing from the UK Post Office. This is a problem. It was showing people stealing upwards of tens of thousands of British pounds from UK post offices. The problem is that this was all wrong. Well, perhaps there was someone who was legitimately stealing, but the core of it was that the software itself wasn't reliable. In fact, over the years, the post office had received an audit report from Ernst & Young that had identified weaknesses. It had heard from a couple of different individuals that that the security was not strong and the data could be changed by technicians who had access to the software, but also it could be, as I think it was reported in the BBC, that sometimes the security met a bug in the software in the system that makes money simply disappear. And so this is a problem. But because again, and sort of worked in a place where the data solutions were separate from sort of the people decisions about what risk are we having, what risk are we accepting, what decisions are we making, it led to actually the prosecution of nearly 1,000 post office employees. And in 2020, not just the prosecution, but the conviction and imprisonment of a lot of employees. And in 2021, 39 people had convictions overturned because the vulnerabilities were finally shown and believed. And so when we talk about why it's important to think about reliability, not just in the data terms, but also the people terms, who's making decisions based off of this data, you have to really think about what does the system look like and what is your responsibility and how do you navigate communicating some of the vulnerabilities, some of the reliability challenges to other players, or of course, how do you just make the system more reliable yourself? And so that's one example of how this all comes together. Next slide, please. So in short, I want you to really reimagine risk and reliability as recognizing and incorporating the human element. It's not just about the data, it's about the data and the people together. Next slide, please. So this pyramid that you see here comes from a 2023 paper, I think just January of this year, by Dickerson and Chen, and talks about the service reliability hierarchy. So really, this specific paper talked about how do we teach students about service reliability engineering and the computer science schools, and what is sort of the hierarchy here. So again, you see from here a lot of the same principles and aspects that are covered in the DRE Con 7 principles, but looking at this level. And again, as you look here, and this is some of what the paper showed, is that it's important to really help students as you're teaching students. And so teaching yourselves as working professionals, how do you think about solving these challenges? What are the human aspects to many of these steps along the hierarchy? Again, the both data piece and human piece can be found at each step of this hierarchy, and that's some of what this paper showed. And it was based on a service reliability engineering course that was taught at a university, I think, over 2 different semesters to get just some confidence in the results of the study. And I'll leave you with, on the next slide, questions you can ask, because I think what I often get when I talk about this is, well, this is good theoretically, but what do I actually need to ask to start this conversation? How do I actually have this conversation with others on my team, with management, with perhaps external stakeholders? So I'll leave you with these 5 questions that you can really take and use to start conversations. The first is, how did you determine that the solution is the right approach, and what did you decide not to do and why? And so ask yourselves these questions, ask your teammates these questions as well as you think about designing for reliability and managing risk in data systems. The second question to ask is, where does the data solution end and the need for new policies begin? And so again, this is a recognition that both internal and external policies and regulation do affect what can be done and what can't be done, and how technology, how data specifically is used. And so as you are having design conversations, as you're having code reviews, as you're implementing and rolling out solutions, really ask the teams involved, where does the data solution end and where does the need for new policies begin? The third question to ask is, did you partner with organizations and individuals throughout design, development, and testing? And this is getting to the first point from the 4 additional things you need to think about in addition to data slide. So really thinking about who are the users, what's the community that's affected by or using the solution that you're working on, and making sure that they're involved throughout the process. Fourth question is, how have you mitigated bias in the technical solutions development implementation? Again, this is just a specific question to get you to think through the additional aspects on top of data to consider. And then the fifth, and I think perhaps one of the most powerful questions to ask, is who has the power to turn on and off this tool? Because with whatever we develop, whatever we're delivering, someone has the ability to say, we're going to keep using it or we're not going to use it. And so I found it really important to know who that person is, or what role has the ability to turn off and to turn on the tool, and what are the factors that that person will make. And so how does that then impact how you're setting a risk tolerance for your organization? How does that impact what reliability levels are acceptable or unacceptable? What is, again, that broader system that the tool or the data that you're working on is operating in? What is actually going to keep that system going or to make it fail? And with that, I will pause, and we have a few minutes left for questions.
Amazing. I love that when it happens like that. So I've got some awesome questions while we're waiting for everyone else in the chat to type in theirs. And I just want to say, I don't know if you were here earlier, but I told a story about how some data reliability issues made it so people lost a lot of time and they had to debug the data pipeline, all that good stuff. Your story is so much more intense. Like, people had to go to jail because of data reliability issues. That's my new, like, you took my story, you like doubled it. And
it's the government aspect in me. We're working when data fails in government programs, people go to jail. Lives are affected in many ways. And so it's very, very important to me, is that the stakes are high with what we do.
Wow. Yeah. That's intense. I mean, it's not just, oh, hey, yeah, some people lost some time, they lost a little money. These are people's lives you're talking about. And so that is, that's pretty wild. And it shows you how vital this whole thing is. Now, question from my side, when you're thinking about all of these 7 principles, which one do you commonly see organizations prioritizing, and then which ones are like deprioritized? And do you have, like, is it in the order that you laid out for a reason, or is it just like you would say one, if you can only do one, do this one?
I'd say do them all, not only do one. Because so I think, and the reason I say that is I think sometimes when people hear all of these things to do, it can be overwhelming. Like, you want me to change my
Yeah.
entire process to figure out how to talk to all of the individuals, to figure out what all the policies are that affect my job, to figure out what all the regulations are that affect me either directly or somewhere down the line of what I'm building, and think of all of the biases that I bring, that others bring, what the data brings, and all of
Mm,
that. And it is a lot, and I recognize that. What I'd offer, though, is that you don't have to solve all of it 100% at once. You can
mhm,
make small inroads across the board and think about what are the values we're using. You can think about who are our consumers, who are our customers, who are our users, and start to map that out. So you can start to have, you can start to make small steps across each of those places. And you don't have to only talk to users and then forget about inclusive design, for example.
mhm. And do you have like assets that you use, maybe surveys or things like that, that you can give to people so it like empowers them to go out and do this work in their companies?
Yeah, so I would point to a couple of things. So I think first, on the sort of user inclusion process, going to the UX schools, and a lot of user design programs have sort of simple, here's how to have conversations with different users. So I think that's one place. Another place that I would point folks to is to the book, The Tech That Comes Next. We ended
Mm,
each chapter, a chapter about technologists, with 25 questions technologists can ask of others, to start these conversations and to go down that path. And then I think the third that I would, the third source that I might point people to is a lot of the evolving conversations on ethics in tech, and specifically inclusivity in tech, and that, especially some work out of the University of Michigan, the University, UCLA, and Georgia Tech, have published a lot of good information on how do you, from a technical standpoint, have these conversations, not just sort of
mhm.
big picture, but really from a technical standpoint.
And one more question from my side on this, because one of the most fascinating things for me about dealing with technical issues is how much they are usually organizational issues also. And so if you're trying to structure this or be a champion for this in your company, how do you see how do you see successful use cases, and what do they do differently than the non-successful ones?
Yeah, this is a great point. Your point about organizational structure is so true and so resonant. So again, I started my career off as a software engineer. I worked at IBM all through college, after undergrad as well, and then went back to get an MBA before making my way to the FBI to work on science and tech issues within the FBI. And I started, especially in my FBI career, really focusing on the technical issues, right? I got to work in
Mm.
the engineering division that like makes all the fun spy toys. I worked with the crime lab. I
Oh,
worked with the terrorist explosive device analytics center, like all the fun technology, right? But what I quickly realized is that to actually get anything done, many times as an organization, and understanding organizational power and understanding that organizational impact. So what I would offer to people is to, one, recognize that you don't have to do it alone. So whether that's
mm,
finding some of your peer technical folks, or finding non-technical folks in your organization who might understand the organizational structure differently, understand again who's got the power to turn on and off solutions, and what goes into that decision-making process, and sort of pairing up and first recognizing there's sort of power in community. And so that's the first thing
mhm,
I'd say. I think the other thing that is, you asked about what's successful for organizations. I think organizations that allow for a clear path from the technical experts to the executive management decision makers is really important. And so ways you can influence that, structure that, figure out where that pipeline is, or if you're in a position to help create that conversation, I think that's the second thing I would suggest.
Incredible. Oh, I mean, I have so many questions about the cool tech, which is totally off topic. But I'm like, what did I hear somebody say the other day? Like a squirrel that sees something and then I go that direction. You can't. I gotta
understand.
focus. I gotta focus.
I understand.
Well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing these insights. I would love to keep the conversation going with you. I know that you are you're active on LinkedIn. I think people can reach out to you there, and there's the chat happening now. So if anybody had questions that they missed and they did not get to ask, feel free to throw them in the chat, and then we will keep this rolling.